Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Monday, April 29th, 2024, and today we're going to be talking about President Biden's 3 pathways to victory in the 2024 presidential election. For all this time now, we've been talking about President Biden doing better in polls, doing worse in polls, President Trump and RFK Jr., and so many different factors that do make an impact on how voters will vote this November 5th, 2024. But what's also important too is to recognize that there are some pathways to victory that months out from this November election, we can chart exactly how they might go. What we know about elections is that honestly, for many states, the results here are quite boring in some instances. Many states have voted the same way since the year 2000, and that isn't going to change in this upcoming election cycle. But what is interesting is taking a look at different alternative scenarios where President Biden could invest resources and his own time into different states and different regions of the country that could result in different avenues to the magic number of 270 electoral votes. To start off on a baseline, I'd like to first take this opportunity to characterize all of the states here that we know just simply aren't going to go in either direction for the opposing party. This is what we like to call safe states, and we use it all the time when drawing characterizations about battleground states and not battleground states. States that are very important and states that, to be fully transparent, are less important for this upcoming election cycle. And so for some of these states too that I'm already going to declare to be safe, I'm doing it more so we don't spend an extensive amount of time talking about that. I really only want to hunker down on the true swing states, that many of which actually aren't going to be changing too heavily here. President Biden has pathways to victory that could be done in a very, very narrow lens here, and for most of them that will be the case. A pathway to victory, of course, can be accompanied by additional swing states, additional districts, for instance, like Nebraska's 2nd or Maine's 2nd congressional district. But fundamentally, this is about the easiest pathway to victory with an investment, again, into different regions in different parts of the country that are going to make all the difference when it comes down to how candidates perform this November, how voters decide who's the next president of the United States. Ultimately, we will find that those states are going to be the most important. But I will say that for any of these characterizations, for any of these victories that we have for President Biden, this isn't to say that it is impossible for him to win additional states in conjunction with them. It is just more to say this is the bare minimum he would need to do if he was to adopt a strategy such as this one, and this is a likely pathway to victory. And so that's what I'm here to show you. And so we'll start off with a map here with a roughly 200 electoral votes for Democrats, roughly 130 for the GOP here. To be fully transparent, these pathways to victory for President Biden will not involve states like Texas or Florida. It won't involve states like Ohio and Iowa. Democrats are also going to do better than I think people might suggest how competitive this election is going to be. People might be overestimating the close nature of it in some of these states, because for the majority of states, this is a decision that they made 4 years ago that isn't going to change. Many of them have reverted to what we call their priors, their past performance in the 2020 election, and really that should be expected for many of these states. States, for instance, like Virginia that voted for Biden by 10.1%, there's no chance here really that Donald Trump makes that margin up in just 4 years. In Colorado, for instance, where President Biden won by 13.5%, nearly 14% in a state that used to be very competitive here. No real chance that Donald Trump makes up the margin there either. And the same thing for Republicans. They find themselves up 8.2% in Iowa in 2020. Chances are President Biden is not all of a sudden going to rebound and win that state again. Same thing can be said in Ohio. And so I implore you to look at this map here not just as a reflection of the 2024 election and its characterizations, but more so to understand the future of 2028 and 2032, that many of these states, for better or for worse, just aren't going to shift. They're going to remain safe, and for some of them, based on the trends we've seen from 2012 to 2016 to 2020, I don't know how more competitive our electoral map can honestly get. I think maybe we will see the inclusion of Texas and some other states into being competitive. Democrats will start seeing a weakened grip on states like Michigan and Pennsylvania that are already swing states here based on some of the trends that we're seeing. But ultimately, our electoral map is very similar to the one we saw in 2016, very similar to what we expected to see even in 2016, even with incorrect data and false polls in some of those instances. And so elections are getting less interesting, not as much swinging back and forth like we saw in the 90s or even in the 2000s, that really changed with President Obama's reelection, and it doesn't look like it's going to change much further. But with that being said, I'm going to characterize New Hampshire and Minnesota as states here that go to President Biden, and Democrats are going to win in Nebraska second, while Republicans win in Maine's 2nd District. And so here we are at the 3 pathways to victory here for President Biden that are amongst the most likely, the ones that are going to be very plausible, very possible here, that I think Democrats are going to look at and say, if we were to choose a strategy, we were to choose a way to win this election, we would dub it XYZ, whatever they want to call it here, but this is how we would do it. And so with 93 remaining electoral votes, let's talk about the pathway to victory, the first one that I think is the most painstakingly obvious, given the results of both the 2020 election and the 2016 election. And that is the Hillary Clinton what if map. Essentially here, what we do is we give President Biden all of the states that Hillary Clinton won in 2016. To list off those swing states, we can actually show them here too. States like Colorado and New Mexico and Virginia and Minnesota and New Hampshire, and, to some people's surprise, the state of Nevada, which has not voted for Republican since 2004. And so looking at this state, it is one that Biden won by an identical margin to Hillary Clinton here, but Democrats have seen some bleeding. But in this scenario, humor me for this, Nevada goes blue, Biden wins all of the states Hillary Clinton did in 2016, and then comes the Rust Belt. Biden loses states like North Carolina, he loses Georgia, he loses Arizona, but he wins in the 3 states that would have been key and crucial that had Hillary Clinton won them in the 2016 election, she would have been president of the United States. And so these states here are also states that President Biden won back in the 2020 election by larger margins than he won in Arizona or Georgia, and he lost the state of North Carolina. Wisconsin, he won by 1. Michigan, he won by 3. Pennsylvania, he won by 1. It isn't unrealistic to see how President Biden would win here. And based on the data that we've seen in Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, they are the best performing states when it comes down to the swing states for the 2024 election. With those 3, Biden's at 276, Trump is at 262. Now let's move on to the second scenario. This second scenario actually does not include any of those Rust Belt states. Republicans win in states like Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania, which brings us actually back to a shocking number here that I think no one wants to see. 306 to 232 is what we were dealt with in 2016, dealt with in 2020, and God forbid we do this again in 2024, regardless of who wins. 306 to 232 cannot be imprinted in my mind for another 4 years. It honestly would be quite a perfect, circle back at it, especially if it does end up, that we do find identical margins in the House like we saw in 2020 versus 2022. There is something weird going on with these numbers here, but that's not the purpose of this video. Let me not get off on a tangent here. Let's talk about what we would dub to be not the Rust Belt strategy, but the Sun Belt strategy, where Democrats sort of, remove themselves out of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania as primary states here. They see maybe some too much bleeding in Detroit and Dearborn and Michigan. They decide that maybe, with the RNC in Milwaukee, that it's not worth it. And now that they have Philadelphia, maybe they could invest in the state, but they're not seeing as much support. And so they decide to go through a route that involves southern states here that can still get them to 270. So where does it come with? Well, it starts in Arizona, a state that Democrats are actually quite counting on when it comes down to House elections, Senate elections, and are very much hoping they win it on the presidential level. Georgia, which doesn't seem to have any major race that is coinciding with the presidential, but in this scenario, Joe Biden wins it as he did in 2020. And I will say too, of all those states that were competitive in 2016, Georgia was actually won by Donald Trump by 5.1%. And so the swing from 2016 to 2020 was more tremendous than it was in Arizona. And so while they both were hard-fought states here, Georgia actually swung by nearly 6 points to the left relative to 2016. And even 2012 to 2016, you saw a smaller amount of shift here, but it was one of the very, very few states that shifted to the left compared to states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Iowa, all of which shifted to the right. So back to our map here. We have Arizona and Georgia blue. So where's the next state? It's not Texas. It's not Florida. It's North Carolina, a state that President Trump won in the last election by 1.3%, and he won in 2016 by 3.7%. It's a state that is very important for Democrats in this governor race here, and it would be counting on the fact that Josh Stein would be carrying Joe Biden over the finish line because Republicans have nominated such poor candidates when it comes down to the governor's race, the state superintendent race, and just generally across some of these races, even in some of the North Carolina House races here, we're finding some very interesting choices for the GOP primaries. Regardless, though, it would count on Democrats outperforming in North Carolina in a way they haven't done since 2008. But to be fair, Democrats hadn't won Georgia since 1992, hadn't won Arizona since 1966. These states are always out of reach until they're not. And so with North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona on the Democratic side, counting on all those states again from the Hillary Clinton column here, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, these states in combination here give Joe Biden a victory 275 to 263. And so this map, I think, while is certainly less likely than the Rust Belt map, and honestly just less likely that Democrats are winning in Arizona, Georgia, and especially North Carolina and not the Rust Belt states, it is always quite interesting to look at as a possibility here. As yes, this is an avenue to Joe Biden's pathway to victory. And honestly, if you took the 2020 election and took away states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and had North Carolina blue as well, that wouldn't be too far out with some of the trends at the broader end that we're seeing here. We're seeing a population influx into Arizona, a population influx into Atlanta and Georgia, population influx North Carolina just gained an electoral vote, a decrease in minority populations in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And so in a way, this sort of tracks for trends that might be, very noticeable 10, 20 years down the line. And so it wouldn't be too far out from what we were expecting. And so moving on, and let's go ahead and recharacterize these states to the third and final, I would say, likely pathway to victory here for the Democratic Party, for President Biden. It actually comes in with a unique twist. And so we start off by characterizing the states that, Donald Trump probably would win. States like Georgia and North Carolina, which are states that, Democrats are hoping to get, but aren't exactly the favorites to right now. And to be fair, they're not the favorites to win. The other states that are characterized on this map here, Joe Biden today, based on the polls, is expected to lose the election, but it still is interesting. Georgia, North Carolina, they go red. That brings Donald Trump to 251 electoral votes. You add in Wisconsin in this case. You add in Nevada in this case. But Democrats win Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Arizona. Now, you might be looking at this and saying, what just happened? Did we just have some weird combination of the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt strategy here? Did you just throw this together and decide this is something that could be a reality? And honestly, the answer is no. Nevada right now is at a unique point. I think Nevada, for what it's worth, is a state that Democrats have consistently been able to rely on, but I wouldn't be shocked if President Trump won it. I think Democrats need it, though. They need it when it comes down to a Hillary Clinton method of winning the election. They need Nebraska's 2nd District, which Hillary Clinton did not win in 2016, but they need all those other states as well, Nevada being included for some instances. We've talked about an electoral map where Nevada isn't necessary. It's not this electoral map. It's actually with Wisconsin blue and Arizona red. But let's talk about this map here and why exactly I think this could be one of the likelier possibilities for our election. To start things off with Michigan and Pennsylvania, President Biden is doing the best in these states out of any of the battlegrounds, even better than in the state of Wisconsin. Arizona, the same cannot be said. President Trump leads by 5 points statewide, and I don't know, really where this came into be until I started questioning what else will be on the ballot in Arizona. We've talked about how down ballot effects could really benefit more up the ballot. For instance, in North Carolina, the governor election there, we could expect President Biden to actually gain from Josh Stein being the Democrat on the governor ballot there too. But in Arizona specifically, there's actually a different amount of, higher stakes when it comes down to Arizona in this election. For instance, most recently, the abortion rights amendment is more than likely going to be on the ballot this coming November. Arizona will probably be voting on the issue of abortion, which inherently helps Democrats. Not to mention, the Arizona Senate race here where Carrie Lake, the Republican, is expected to lose by a whopping 6, 7, 8 points. It's very hard to see how on a nationalized race, Democrats are winning by 6, 7, 8, and President Trump is winning by 5. Something must be off. And when you take a look at the crosstabs here, a lot of that lack of support for President Biden is coming from Democrats who are expressing discontent by saying they're not voting for anyone in this general election. But when it comes down to down ballot races, they're there for Democrats in the House, they're there for Democrats in the Senate, and what history tells us is that more likely than not, they will be there for President Biden, but just don't want to admit it today. And so while that may be something that we need to see closer to the election, that's what drives me to think that in a map like this one, it is entirely plausible that Wisconsin goes red, but Arizona goes blue, especially with that abortion referendum on the ballot. That is a sort of cheat code for Democrats to win elections that they want to run alongside, right? That is a reason to think the Democrats could do quite well in the state, and I honestly wouldn't waver from it. Michigan, Pennsylvania, I've given you my reasoning for those states, but also I was more comfortable characterizing those Rust Belt states together. Wisconsin has just always been a little bit more difficult for Democrats to win. Trump won it by the most in 2016. Trump performed the best there in 2020 out of those 3 states. And so I think that would replicate itself in 2024. The question is, does Trump perform well enough to win the state? I don't know. But in this scenario, that would be the case. But still, President Biden has a backup. That backup is across the country all the way down in Arizona. And where does that bring him? 271 to 267. And so all of these scenarios here, I would like you to take with a grain of salt. With months out from the election, this may not be where we are in November of 2024. But I will say this. These maps are not meant to be an absolute either. There's absolutely a possibility that in a map like this one, Wisconsin is also blue, Nevada is also blue, Georgia is also blue, and maybe North Carolina. But these are the scenarios in which President Biden reaches 270 through potentially some paths of least resistance. And it would be very interesting to see if any of these become our reality, because they aren't exactly far out from what we are seeing in the polls, the fundraising data, the trip visits, everything altogether seems to suggest that our electoral map here is working in a very interesting way. And there may be some matchups of states that you never have otherwise expected 4 years ago, 8 years ago, 12 years ago that are going to be what we see this November. So with that being said, thank you guys for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.